It looks like.
Yeah. It's difficult to do anything different at the moment out there because everyone has joined, the wave of digital
Well,
stream.
I think we all agree that the digital transformation number one has been that COVID for a lot of brands, especially in the watch industry. I mean, we haven't seen. I've been a lot Zooming around, WhatsApping around, FaceTiming around, Skyping around in the last few days. Now even try something new. Well, I mean, the period is unprecedented. An unprecedented period obviously involves unprecedented actions, and I think it's a good thing. We have seen a lot of different things. I mean, not everything will stay, but a lot of things that we initiate maybe will also transform the way we interact and the way we do business in the future.
Totally agree. It is, how can I say, it is a real handicap at the moment not being tech savvy in a way. So I'm learning myself every day. So in so many ways. So it is interesting because at the same time we are ambassadors of the mechanical world, but we're becoming experts of the digital world. So
Yeah, see the anachronic world of watchmaking always has to get confronted to the digital reality.
Absolutely, and maybe it's for good as well. Maybe it can also give, like the impact of smartwatches in the last few years. It has definitely given a boost, to probably creativity and risk taking in watchmaking. What do you think? Do you feel the same?
Well, see, it's interesting how we are in an increasingly changing world. I remember when we talked about smartwatches back in 2010 or 11, and journalists asked me what I think, and I said, well, it's going to fundamentally transform our industry one way or the other. And I had this reaction and even received some SMS from other CEOs of watch brands saying, how can you say something like this? It just doesn't make sense. It's never gonna affect our industry. And I mean, sitting 10 years later, well, it changed dramatically our industry, but I would say what happens now will even more change our way of business. And it's interesting to see that, we start to see that people are active online. Even the most, I would say, conservative brands look into selling online, interacting online. I mean, right now it's a sort of, I would say, a multiplication of different things, and none of us is really clear where it's going. But it's interesting, and it leaves really and creates a lot of opportunities.
You're so right. When in 2015 we started with the limited edition, of course, the vision was to project the underground independent watchmaking to a wider public, let's say. Because when I started, I said to myself, if I'm going to start something, it has to be something that has not been completely done before. I'm not claiming to have been the first one, but it was still underdeveloped. And I remember contacting the first brands in those days, and you were not one of those. So, and I'm still grateful for that because you were at Romain Jerome at the time. Contacting most of the brands that would kind of look at me like, what are you talking about? And it was already 2015. How much things have changed now when you think that we had 4 brands and now we have over 30 brands and increasing and increasing.
Well, increasing, and you've become a platform, interesting platform. I think a valuable platform for collectors for interaction too. And I mean, that's the reason why I'm very happy to be together with you on that live today. So,
thank you very much. Thank you very much. What do you think? I had another question, but I'll keep it for the end because I want to first, for the few that would have not heard of you or not seen you before, because you've been a little bit behind the scenes in the last I would say 2-3 years.
The last 3-4 years, yes.
Yes, exactly. So Manuel, I first heard of Manuel at the time when Manuel was involved with the Richmond. Well, that's bad. With the Swatch group, and Manuel, already in the Swatch group, if you allow me, you managed to bring a little bit of independent thinking within the Swatch group, getting the green light to develop one of the brands as an independent watchmaker rather than a standard group brand. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think that's very accurate. I think I brought a lot of independent feeling into the big corporation and group. Well, with success for the brand, maybe with less success for myself, because being an independent spirit is not always easy in a big corporation. But I mean, I had this chance to have a mentor, which was Mr. Hayek, late Mr. Hayek Senior, which trusted me, trusted my ideas, trusted my strategy, and gave me a sort of, little but comfortable little free room where we could actually build a brand independent of the organization of Swatch Group. And I must say it was a great challenge. We started this company back in 2001, obviously historical watch brand dating back to the 18th century. But basically, when it was taken over by the Swatch Group, there were just like 2 or 3 people left. It was a small little endeavor. I think I'm trying to remember, but I think the first year we were something like $250,000 turnover. So it was
Oh
just
yeah.
insignificant. You have to imagine that we already back then the group was I think over $4 billion turnover. So who'd care about us anyway? And I think this was the biggest motivation factor, and that what gave us this total independence to do whatever we wanted somehow, as long as we were successful. We were really a small team. We were 3 at the beginning, and we built this company with a total independent spirit up to a certain stage. Obviously, after a few years, after certain successes in markets, we started to integrate certain subsidiaries in certain countries, and took also advantage of the organization of the Swatch Group. So it's an interesting endeavor. It was a mix between independence in the way we build our business, and the support and backup of a big corporation that helped us financially speaking, first of all, but also with access to movements, which we all know is a bit of the key element. And yeah, well, I mean, it was a great endeavor. 10 years. We built this company from 3 people to 90 people. See, I tend to say people first. And from, I think at the end when I left, there were close to $35 million turnover. So it was really a great success story. For me, it was a fantastic experience, because I joined this company. I was 29. I mean, it was like no experience, just some ideas, just a bit of independent spirit, and just a lot of energy trying to build something. And for me, it was like incredible 10 years, my 30s, basically.
To the point that I can tell you, Manuel, so I've been 20 years. I started 2002 with the Richmond Group, and I was in charge of a very, very insignificant brand at the time, which was Montegrappa Writing Instruments. And when I heard the first time about Jacquet Droz, and I saw the watches and all of that, I didn't know, honestly, that Jacquet Droz was part of the Swatch Group. And then when I heard that, I thought the guy that was telling me that was actually joking. So I recognized there was it was different. Also, even in terms of I remember in some regions you were actually using different retailers and different medias even to develop the brand altogether.
Well, that I would say that was the biggest advantage and disadvantage at the same time. We had to work outside of the group simply because we couldn't afford to work in the subsidiaries. Big corporations have subsidiaries, organization. When you enter into a country, often you have allocation keys. These allocation keys, as they say, well, they charge you a certain amount of money to be part of the local organization. And when you have a small company and you want to be successful, and you are in a corporation like Swatch Group, where you basically at that time were an independent, somehow an entrepreneur, and you had to deliver results, and some of these results were obviously being profitable. We had no other choice than trying to work outside of the beaten tracks, at least to kickstart. That's what I mentioned before. I mean, we really worked outside of the framework as long as we reached a certain level, and when we managed to reach a certain level, and depending on if we found good people, we integrated the subsidiary. But I must say that was what was interesting for the Swatch Group, is that there was this kind of rebellious independent brand within the whole organization that showed that you can do things differently, you can be successful. I mean, in certain countries we were outperforming a lot of the other high-end brands, but then again, that the backside, there's always a backside of it, and everything is that, well, we were not always appreciated by the markets, because when you do things out of the beaten track with people that are not the normal partners or not I would say, complying within the regulations of a big group, then you don't always have friends. You create quite a number of enemies. And I think it was interesting because it was really being independent in a big organization with the advantages and the disadvantages, and that's throughout the whole business itself, whether it was with the brand, whether it was supply, or whether it was distribution.
Because I will also just remind the followers that are tuned in now, keep your questions. We're going to ask Manuel some questions at the end. And feel free to interact. We're here on Instagram and on YouTube at the same time. So shoot off your questions. There's no formalities. We can really try to get some interesting insights and facts from Manuel. So this experience, far from being easy, Manuel, of course, because you took the alternative track. Probably you were saying how difficult it was in the end. Probably toughened you up for the next challenge that you took on board, because one would think, what can be more challenging than possibly developing an independent brand within the Swatch group? And you decided to take on Romain Jerome, which at the time was a big success for one collection that was launched at the time. And you correct me if I'm wrong, the Titanic. I remember the days 2006, I guess. And then the question that was asked to you was to turn it into a brand, wasn't it?
Yeah. Well, first of all, to make it into a profitable organization, which it was for a few years, but also to make it into the global brand. I mean, it was a concept brand, one concept brand with a concept that was very successful. I mean, which really helped the brand to emerge in a very rapid, very quickly. But it was also a very regional concept. It was, the Titanic was a huge provocation, but it was also a provocation that in certain countries and in certain cultures was perceived as negative. Asia was a closed door for the Titanic collection because of the karma. So it was basically selling very well. There was a lot of excitement around the brand, but there was no structure, no organization. There was no real collection at the end, and it was all about one theme, which, again, we needed to, where people said, okay, what's next? What's coming next? So it was, I would say, and that was the interesting part for me. It was, I would say, on the other extreme of the chess play of watchmaking, because on one side, Jacquet Droz was very traditional brand and a big corporation concentrated on craftsmanship, on movements. And on the other, there was a brand that was totally loose, with a concept, with basically watchmaking around storytelling. So that was a very, very interesting challenge. I mean, I enjoyed it as much as I did Jacquet Droz. I enjoyed Romain Jerome. I did it for another 9 years. So I did 10 years in Jacquet Droz and about 9 years in Jacquet Droz and about 8 years in RJ. Somehow my cycles seem to be 8-year cycles. Well, why not? And I really enjoyed it. I mean, we had fun doing incredible products. I mean, video games was fun. Batman was fun. It was something else, but I enjoyed it very much. Very
good. And I was going to say the cycles in the watch industry, when we see this big reshuffling of management, every obviously crisis, but also regularly throughout periods of time, seems to be between 3 and 5 years for what I have observed in my career. So 8 years, we can call it loyalty.
Yeah, well, persistence, loyalty, maybe a little bit of being too focused sometimes on certain things and not able to let loose, or just wanting to make it happen. I don't know. It's I think it's a bit of a mix of everything. But Yeah, I tend to be very loyal, and I mean, it's interesting for me. I mean, I'm born in the watch industry. That's you can really say that because I was brought up in a city called Grenchen, which, besides sounding horribly uninteresting, is also the center of watchmaking. It's where ETA movement factories are, is where Breitling has its headquarters.
Yes.
And I mean, the whole city is basically built around watchmaking. And my grandparents' parents have been in the watch industry. So I'm really born into it. And I think it helps. Sometimes it doesn't, but in my case, it helped to really develop that sort of passion for it and this idea of trying and pushing the boundaries of watchmaking. And both brands, I could do that.
Despite what's happened now, obviously, to Romain Jerome these days, was that experience, would you define it positive? How important was it for you, and how defining was it for the mark that you seem to be wanting to give in whatever you do, which is about being independent in mind, creative in mind, and bring that creativity factually on the brands that you touch?
Well, see, it's a very different ball game in both cases. I mean, Jacquet Droz, I built the whole identity from scratch, all the products. I mean, I did even the first, the Grand Second, which is still the origin and the base of the brand. And there's some interesting story around that product where everybody relates it back to the 18th century. But you know, you have to keep a bit of a secret when you do watchmaking. But I'm happy to see that 10 years after I left, it's still the same identity. Some things changed, something evolved in the good direction, but the brand has been the essence, the identity, the framework I build around the brand has been maintained and continues to be developed. And for me, this is a success because whether it's me or somebody else, I'm happy that I could build something that will last and continue, and an identity that hasn't been changed. And I would say where what has been put in place has been respected. I'm a bit frustrated and also a little bit disappointed with RJ because
Sorry, Manuel. And also within a group where certain decisions can be made with a snap of two fingers, which is
true. Yeah, well, you see, I must say these radical decisions in my case, seem to happen more in the independents than in the group brands, because I think a group also understand that it's not as much as about ego as maybe in independent watchmaking. And if something works, why should you change it? Just make it better. And I must say certain things that have been done in Jacquet Droz. I don't like everything, and I can't stand for everything, but I can, for the philosophy and for the majority of the things, I can say, well done, guys. And it's in line with what I would have liked to see or what I had in my mind. And I think this is what I find very respectful, because it's not the management that changed the brand, you know, and the brand is what is the value. It's not the people who run it. And I think
we have a first-hand witness here in Amer, who's connected with us, the Orophile Amer, and Fadel as well. Giancarlo, nice to see you as well. Amer is saying that he's still treasuring his Jacquet Droz that he probably got in those days, and it's testament to.
Well, I must say, as much as he values his watch, his Jacquet Droz, I value him, because I remember him when he was like, I wouldn't say the age, because it makes me much older, but when he bought his, and I even remember the watch he bought. He bought this watch in Lausanne. It was a Grand Second in ceramic, and he really was passionate on that. That was one of the things I really. Okay, and you paid full retail for it. That's true. That was not.
Nothing wrong to pay full retail. Nothing wrong with that.
So I mean, and this is again, I mean, the fact that it was what was built, what was good, what was fundamental, was maintained, developed. Like everything has to develop and evolve over time, but in a respectful way. And I think a bit frustrating part with RJ is that there's been too many things wanted to be changed immediately. You know, it's always the same thing. first thing is you change the logo for what? I mean, it's not what people look for. It's not what people buy. You think you need to put certain number of elements into it, and I think you need to be careful, because a brand is like a living organism, and you got to be careful to really nurture it and develop it into the right direction. And I think there's been too many changes too quickly.
Giancarlo is saying you should have not left RJ.
Well, then you can also say I should not have left Jacquet Droz. I mean, I think it's also good to change and try new things. And you know, in life, I always go from the principle 8 years or 9 years is a lot. So after a certain number of years, it's also interesting to change, to try out new things, to evolve. I mean, I must say, again, I mean, I would have. Asking me, I should not have left. Yes, maybe not, because what happened, and I didn't want this to happen. I mean, some people said, "Oh, you should be happy with yourself. It means that people are not able to make it run, and that you basically were capable to manage the company in a way it was successful." And for me, I don't care about that. For me, what's really important is that what I created or what I built or what I did still is going to be there over time. I mean, I'm much prouder. It's a bit like the kids, you know. If you want your kids to grow, you want your kids to develop, you want the kids to there's no pleasure in things that suddenly that you invested 8 or 9 years of your life working hard, trying to make it happen, that suddenly disappear. And I think that's
for them. Sorry.
Yeah, and I think that for me is, for me this is it's a fail in the sense that, not that I fail, but it's a fail because it's not there anymore.
Yeah, but I mean, what has happened with RJ in those years is very much in the minds, as we can see also from Amer and Giancarlo, in the minds of people that appreciated that big effort to, because it wasn't easy. You were trying to make viable something that had to be off the scale by definition to be viable. So it's two things that are difficult to combine, isn't it?
Well, it's how to say. I mean, trying to make a steel watch with a 77 value movement desirable at the price of almost $20,000. Yes,
yeah.
You got to give a little bit more than just the basics, you know. And I think that's what we try to do. We try to tell stories, emotions. We put a lot of focus on what we could. I mean, which is basically dials, cases, craftsmanship, designs, stories. Knowing that our movements, aside maybe of 1 or 2 executions like the spacecraft or the moon orbiter, where we specifically developed, but the reality was that our base was a solid but common base. So how do you create the brand? How do you create emotions with a solid but standard base? I mean, that obviously is the case of 400 other competitors or 300 other brands.
Well, Giancarlo here is giving us a great comment, because I had exactly the same comment. We're lucky enough to sell a spacecraft. Unfortunately, after you left the company somehow, but it happened. And, in explaining the watch to the client that was interested, it was a dentist here in the UK. We spent ages talking about edge design, talking about mechanics, talking about vintage analog ways of displaying the time. So the amount of fat in those watches was far beyond the simple concept that were coming first. Especially when you talk about the animations, for example, or some other crazily creative ideas that came out in those days. So sorry.
No, I mean, and I think that's what it should be. I mean, at the end of the day, strong brands, there's a few around, but we're an independent. And independent, you have different fields of expression. Either you have the technical expertise, the craftsmanship, the know-how, the story, the patrimony, or then you just have a bit of guts and a little bit of creativity, and you're just trying to make things in a different way. And I think RJ somehow was a fresh ball of air. It was an ovni or a UFO in the watch industry in all sorts of
it was a UFO,
yeah. And I think that's what we all need. We need these UFOs. Obviously, we need them to hold on and to stay there for the future. But that's what makes it exciting. That what makes it collectible. That's what makes it talkable. I mean, it's good that provokes. It's good that it polarizes.
Well, I
people love it and hate it.
Absolutely, I can give you a news as well. And before we answer one of Blick's question, and I feel bad about this question because we'll have to give an answer to that. But recently, you mentioned him, Bill CKQ. You mentioned him the Batman, and yes, recently we've been asked for a Batman, to source a Batman, and also a Super Mario as well.
Yeah,
and I can tell you there aren't around. And I can tell you that the prices that are requested by collectors to give up on one are really really high. So there is a lot to be said about what is collectible and what is not collectible in
well,
and then I'll let you answer the question: what happened to Romain Jerome? Well, I can do it if you want.
Well, I can tell you something which is quite interesting. I mean, myself, I mean, I'm still asked, I want a Super Mario, can you find me one, or a Space Invader? And some of these watches, maybe not all, because it's always also difficult to always be right, but the video games, some of the spacecrafts, some of the watches really have a second market value, and despite the fact that the brand has been closed down, I mean, the market price is sometimes even above the retail price back then. So for me, this is obviously what I can say. Well, I consider that being successful because that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to not just sell watches or make a business.
And that crystallizes what you've done, because there are so many brands that have come and gone, and still, some of those pieces would be so. How can I say, sought after on the market, regardless of what happened to the brand. For example, I could mention a few, but no, it's very interesting. So the next step then for you, Manuel, was from Romain Jerome. Where do you go? I really don't know. I'm quite. Yeah.
It looks like I spend a lot of time on the sun. My confinement seems to be quite outside with it. No, but
don't feel sorry. I don't feel sorry for you. Don't worry, it's all good. And
I was not fishing for it neither. Now listen, I mean, I thought about. I told myself, okay, I did 10 years for one brand, another 10 years almost for another brand. It was time for me to take a bit of a step back, to take it a bit easier also, because if I do things, I tend to do them to the extreme or to the maximum. That often means a lot of sacrifices and personal sacrifices. And I decided that after that, I need a bit of, and I just step a little bit back and work in a more, I would say, relaxed and with a little bit more distance. So I started to, not really wanting, but I started to do a bit of consulting business here and there because I was asked to help a few brands. And it looks like that seems to develop as an interesting activity for me, because I try to concentrate on what I like to do is create strategies, create stories, develop new products, new marketing ideas. And I don't need to take care too much about organization and financial parts, which sometimes is also quite comfortable, I must say. So today I have about 6 or 7 brands I consult for. Some of them I'm not allowed to talk about, and I respect that. And interestingly enough, it goes from $500 watches up to $500,000 watch companies, from Russians to Germans and Swiss and Japanese. So it's quite an exciting environment in which I work. I can talk about a few things, obviously, because I've in certain cases they're very happy to push me in front. So whenever it doesn't work, I have to take the responsibility. Others they don't want to. I've been involved quite a lot with Louis Erard lately, for whom I was asked to do a new strategy, which I did at the end of last year, and trying to build up a new product offer. And I did this, and the first thing I did for them was the collaboration with Alain Silberstein, which I obviously knew from my RJ times. There's other...
Which, as a complete coincidence, I have here on my desk.
That doesn't sound like a coincidence, but it actually is.
I want to know, Manuel, besides when you presented the strategy to the guys at Louis Erard, when you came up with the idea of Alain Silberstein and flipping a Regulateur onto a completely, postmodern concept of design, which belongs to the French designer Alain Silberstein, obviously. How were their faces? How did they react?
Well, like in usual, when I come up with ideas, in general, they have a bit of let's say reserve about things, but I think I tend to be convincing sometimes, and I think it's a brand that needed a new breath, a new direction, a new energy, and I think they were very happy to try a certain number of things. It's obviously much easier to dare and create and innovate in a brand that has no choice than to do so. And this idea of collaborations, well, Alain was the first one. And I must say, it was a home run. I was surprised myself. We just said, okay, we want to do it very limited because we want to try to build a collector's brand in the mid-price segment, meaning watches that sell between $1,000 and about $3,000-$4,000. Why? Because let's face it, above 4,000, the attractive effect of Rolex is so strong that it's very difficult to be able to compete with something interesting. And below 1,000, well, connected watches, smart watches, Apple watches also have a huge aspirational effect. So we said, okay, why not build a collectible brand in a price segment where there is no one actually active? A Swiss-made, well-made, high-quality watch brand with a lot of stories, a lot of craftsmanship, a lot of collaborations, but for an affordable price. And I must say, well, we said, okay, first collaboration, Alain. Alain is a good friend, and Alain was up and running very quickly. So we managed to do the whole collaboration in a very short period of time, almost too quickly, because then we need a bit more time for the second phase of it. But it's been successful. We have signed up a few others, one or two very famous watchmakers. We're going to continue this idea where every year we will do a limited edition of 178 pieces with a watchmaker on one side. And if it's successful, we're actually going to do a capsule. And the capsule is not just a dial based on the Regulateur, but a full collection. Triptych, to be very precise, 3-hand Regulateur and 1 push chrono. I like 1 push chronos for whatever reason. And that's going to be hitting the market at the end of the year, again with Alain. And at the same time, we do another collaboration with a watchmaker on 178 pieces. This one's going to hit the market too at the end of the year, and I'm pretty proud of the watches. But we said, okay, we not only want to do watchmakers, we also want to move into other territories, interesting territories, creative territories. So we signed a collaboration with a contemporary artist. We signed a collaboration with a famous architect. We signed collaborations with interesting brands, with interesting people. And it's a lot about people business, and I'm very happy to do that. So the rollout's going to be obviously on a longer period. We don't want to make too many of them, but we want it to be really exciting and collectible. So that's an interesting project.
I remember going to Basel when the big financial crisis hit in 2008, And Louis Erard, I think, if I'm not wrong, they were living very, very good times because the market had gone so high in terms of price positioning and all of that, that everybody expected entry-level brands to do well. And I remember Louis Erard was pointed as one of the brands that was offering great quality, great value for the money, but with a very in a very conservative kind of way, of course, making reference to the past of switchmaking, regulators, Jacquet, and all the. So you managed to flip that over completely.
And with some inspiration of Jacquet Droz as well back then, which is okay. It's funny for me somehow it's funny for me somehow to work with a brand that where basically the regulator somehow looks like a Jacquet Droz, their first watch. But I find, this is it's you can never say never to anything. I mean, life is sometimes interesting how it leads you to certain places, but. I think what the strength of Louis Erard back then was to say, okay, we want to make affordable mechanical Swiss watches. And they were indeed the first and the most affordable ones on the market. But the reality is, as an independent, when you go into a logic of something that's price quality based, well, your competition is going to follow very quickly. And the reality is when you're a brand in a big group that has access to movements, well, you can always undermine the price. You can always undercut the price because you're buying power, whether it's in movements, but also in cases or dials. Well, is often better because your volumes are much higher. So you can't build only on the price. You gotta offer something different. I mean, for us, it's important in this particular case to keep this like super fair and super cool price. But offer something that we are the only ones to offer. Unique, different, exclusive, provocative sometimes, but respectful of traditions and know-hows. I mean, we talk about coming up with watches with stone dials, with full fire enamel dials, with Jacquet dials, we're talking about sapphire crystal cases, we talk about lots of things, but for prices that you could basically, you can take out the zero on what other brands offer you. I mean, we have projects with like semi-precious mineral stone dials for less than $3,000 for mechanical Swiss-made watches.
Yeah, because also there's a sticker on, but you can see the level of the finishing as well is not one of those that make you think there has been a lot of compromises. So you have kept that really, really cleverly upmarket. Manuel, of course you have been a big ambassador to make my joys these days. So now there is a category called the independent watchmakers, which I don't remember being there 15 years ago. So in that respect is amazing time. So you have started to plant the seed from very far back in a way when there was no need for independent watchmaking, because also when you were a Jacquet Droz, I was a Richmond, and all the mainstream brands were flying. Any brand of any group was kind of doing great. I remember Richmond Group, launching Panerai, acquiring Jaeger-LeCoultre, acquiring IWC in those days. Everything was flying and all of that. But possibly after the big crisis hit in 2008, the seed that people like yourself have planted before of still not giving up in thinking differently have then brought this new category that, if you ask me, these days is the flesh and the blood of the watch industry. And not only because of inspiring the bigger brands, but because they work on a business model that is actually more viable to me, which is more focused on what's the demand and what's the offer. So if there's no demand, we don't produce, which is not necessarily what happens, in the established brands that have to cover the 5 continents of the planet.
Yeah, no, but at the same time, we create this demand. We also, by doing different, creative, unique, innovative things, we also create a certain demand. We create excitement. I mean, look, it's interesting because, again, I work for other companies. I mean, even work for a Russian company, which I have a lot of fun working with, and a lot of fun working with the people. And I think it's interesting because also for me, to culturally speaking and humanly speaking. But the reality is that what happens today is just going to accelerate the polarization of of the watch industry. I mean, we all can agree on the fact that the strongest will definitely get stronger. We see this if you look today in the auction markets and the online auction markets. Well, the brands that or products of brands that were successful are still as successful as before. There's not been a lot of changes, and the ones which were maybe a bit weaker, maybe not very clear in the way, or not had a clear strategy or direction, they're gonna suffer. So basically, there's gonna be space for the strongest, but also for the fittest and the most agile ones. And I think that's interesting for me, is to work with brands that need this creative input, ideas, strategies to become more agile, to become more fit, to become more interesting, because there is a huge opportunity. Because whenever there's a crisis, a major crisis, it changes the ball game. It will not fundamentally change what we have seen in the last years as a sort of trend towards mega brands. I can say without taking a lot of risk that Rolex and Patek probably going to get out of this crisis even stronger than they get into it. I think we all agree on that. But then again, if you look at the big groups, well, it's a bit more challenging there, because maybe it's another way of doing business. But I think, and I'm convinced, that if you look at the smaller independents, there's a lot of potential, and these are the ones who excite, create. These are the ones which are attractive. I mean, you know.
Did you see it come? Did you see it come from when you were at Jacquet Droz and then embraced Romain Jerome and the work that, I don't know, from the work Harry Whiston was doing with the contemporary watchmakers, with the Opus, with the Opus at the time. So did you see it come after the year 2010, this flourishing of independence?
Yeah, well, I mean, it built over the time. I mean, when I started in the watch industry in 2000, I mean, it's 20 years back. I shouldn't say that. That's probably why I desperately tried to keep a good tan. But anyway, I mean, the number of brands that have appeared is tremendous. I mean, on year by year basis, there's been newcomers, but at the end of the day, if you look at the last 20 years, how many newcomers has really brought something interesting on the table? Not so many. And I think that's going to be interesting. I mean, I'm happy to see brands like the Butine, like Max's brands and so on, like Recep's brand, bring something really interesting on the table. And I think we're going to see that segmentation and polarization in the future. Yes, you see fundamental changes. I think the world in which we live is also, people are maybe, there is no space for 10 leaders. There's a space for one leader, maybe one challenger, but there's a space for a lot of creators and innovators. And I think what we see
that's one of the questions that came about as well. Is there a limit to how many independents the market can absorb in that respect? Of course, there are no limits to creativity, but in terms of where the market is going, do you see any limits, or are you happy to say no, there are no limits, you should just throw it out there and see what happens?
Well, I think there will be a bit of brands will come and go to a certain extent, maybe, because they will sustain, they will be there as long as they're creative, innovative, as long as they bring something interesting on the table. Just being a brand with a bit of marketing dollars here and there, I don't think it's going to be sufficient, because the bigger, the mega brands are just eating that part of the market up. But how many? Well, I always say that there's space for maybe 10 mega brands, maybe worst case 5, best case 20, but not much more. And there's definitely space for maybe 20, 40, 50 creators. It depends how niche they are and how much they structure their organization in a way they can actually make a decent living out of it. Because at the end, even if we create, even if we innovate, even if we do beautiful objects, I mean, the only way to succeed over time is to be profitable. And I get back to this in the reality of RJ. I mean, at the end of the day, when I was at this company, we were 12 people. We were 12. It's not a lot, but 12 made sense for the number of pieces we made, a bit over about 1,200 watches, more or less, per year. it worked. But then when I read that when they decided to file for bankruptcy, there were 35 people. Somehow it doesn't make sense to me, you know.
Yeah.
I think again there is space for creativity, and should be space for creativity, even more so in this digital world we're living in. I think, you know, we all like this anachronic idea of something that's still made by hand, with passion, with craftsmanship, with a lot of blood and sweat, something human. In a world where everything becomes digital, I think this is a very
There is an element. Do you think there is an element of wearing the cap in a way, because the biggest and the more monopolizing the big brands have become, and the more a certain portion of people have been proud to say, I don't like that, I want my own, you know, I like my own choice, I like this guy that is doing these crazy things in his corner, and that's what I am, and that's what I like in him. So it's counterintuitive, but the bigger the big becomes, and the bigger the small can become as well on the back of that, because there are a lot of people in modern day society. I can tell you 90% of our customers are entrepreneurs. I can say this. So there are people that they like to think with Romain in a way. And I think independent watchmaking owes a lot to this category of people.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I think, you know, I mean, this passion for watchmaking has to be built somehow, somewhere. And I think the big brands are obviously contributing to visibility, attractivity, awareness of watchmaking. And the good thing is, if they're really well, the way they do it, and it's the case, if you look at, I mean, Rolex, Patek, we can always criticize here and there certain things, or AP, I mean, but the product is good. It's valuable. It's something that sustains value. That's a good investment to a certain extent, and that gives confidence for a lot of collectors to say, okay, I also want to try something different, something new, something that that's a bit out of the beaten track, because we're not all want to have the same. We all not want to be, you know, we like to distinguish each other, being distinguished from each other. But I think that's why I say it's a very interesting thing, that we need each other. We nurture each other. The big brands, well, they give us the credibility to exist, and at the same time, we create the creativity, the ideas, the concepts that maybe they can use in the future too. And I think any industry only can work with the balance between the big or bigger corporations, or big groups, or big brands, and the small independents, and that's why we need to support this independence. And I think it's interesting. I mean, all this community that I guess today is online is exactly because of that reason. I mean, it's
Absolutely.
Watchmaking is totally useless to a certain extent, but so damn passionate. And interesting that we all really, you know, we all get a bit of a virus, the watchmaking virus, if you can use this word nowadays. But
sorry to cut you, but it makes me think, because we had a comment from Amer, the Europhile as well. We were discussing in a live with Amer on how much, obviously, the big brands, and by the way, Rolex, Patek, and Audemars Piguet are actually independent as well, technically speaking.
Yeah, that's technically speaking, it's true.
Yeah, we were saying how much all the big brands, they create the ecosystem that then allows the small brands to, the small independent creative brands, to justify the existence. And also, Amer is saying, then it's up to the customer to see how deep he wants to go, you know, deeper and deeper in a world that has a lot to offer.
But I think, and see, that's why I like to work on different price segments, because I think this independent feeling of watchmaking is not just something for high end. It's not just something for people with a certain buying power. I think we can also create independent watchmaking, interesting, creative watchmaking for accessible levels, because we also need to gather and attract new clientele. I mean, because saying it in a bit of a frustrating word, I mean, if I want to buy a watch and I don't have that much money, well, I'll definitely going to go for a Rolex, because I have a certain certainty of second market value and investment value. But also but also because there's not so much interesting things around. There's a few brands, more and more. I must say we see some initiatives in RAs or other that I can applaud and are very interesting, and there is space for something in this price segment too. And that's why it's also interesting for me to not only work with brands and selling watches for $100, $200, $300,000.
Yeah. And that sounds good as well, Manuel, because also the limited edition, we're trying to reinforce that that segment, which is not really represented so far, where I recognize the same kind of need as well. And we discussed again with Amir the other day as well on this point. There is a Chien Blanc saying, the real independents doing the hard job, the hard work now. There will be more room for them. Big commercial groups could be hit because, I think Chien Blanc will ask Manuel the question as well. From my point of view, is because when you're a manager of one of those brands, you are asked, how many watches you're going to sell all over the world. You have to fill every single retailer in every continent with the same amount of watches. And looking at what is the demand is not necessarily the first thing. And then the trouble is when a crisis hits, the watches are on the shelves, and that's a big problem. Manuel, did you want to say yours on this one? We only have a few minutes on Instagram, so we're going to try to wrap it up.
Get a few questions.
So there's this was the first one. There was another one that I missed before. From Amir again, it says, do you agree the big brands are the gateway for people to, I always say this, when you spend your first chunk of money on something like a Patek and a Rolex, then it sounds and it feels not too bad to spend a lot of money on an anachronistic, as you say, useless kind of tool these days that you can only love for what the inner value of the mechanics inside or the design.
Mm.
So do you agree with that?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's like everything else. I mean, you start to collect with the basics. It's the basics that attract you, and something somehow we all forget, but most of us, at least me and a lot of collectors I know, started collecting watches with Swatch. So because that was the first collectible watch brand that actually existed. I mean, and I agree, we need these gateways. We need these brands that build this passion and collectible approach. In the past, it was Swatch back in the 80s. And today, maybe it's Rolex or Patek or these brands. And I think they, like everything else, they are the entry door to the passion for watchmaking. Because we're too small, our voice is too little. Even if we have lots of supporters and platforms, whether it's the Horophile or whether it's the limited edition. I mean, it's still a small community, and our voice is not necessarily heard from the outside world. And that's why we need these brands to give us this possibility to attract passionate people about watchmaking, and we can offer something else.
Before Instagram kick us out, because I think we still have only a few minutes, Monsieur Noun, merci d'être intervenu, is asking us, should watch companies launch limited editions several times a year to end up like fast fashion? So obviously, Monsieur Noun is pointing out, unfortunately, another habit that came about in the watch industry of keep launching and launching and launching, because most brands survive on the novelties rather than on the core collections. What do you?
Yeah, I think I agree. It's a bit. It's a difficult thing because, unfortunately, collectors want something new. Strive for the newness. Strive for the exclusive. Strive for the unique. And well, yes, indeed, the reality is a bit of a over limited edition approach. But don't forget one thing. First of all, it gives you credibility, gives you a platform, gives you a reason to talk about it. Limited edition also have a have an aspect that we always tend to forget, is because it's limited, your production risk is less. I mean, I see this with Louis Erard is a very good example. I mean, we did a limited edition of 178 on Silberstein. We could have done 500, but when we started the project, we didn't know how much we could sell. We said, oh, we're probably going to sell about 200, maybe 400. Okay, we took the risk to make less, because with the idea that if we sell more, it creates a certain second market value to it. And at the same time, we knew with 178, we can still negotiate the price for 200, because, you know, that little 10% less, you could still negotiate with your suppliers. Yeah. And you don't have like an open production. It means that you know how you do your pricing. You can be much fairer with your prices. You don't anticipate future sales or whatever. And it makes it easier to actually manage also stock and supply.
There is next question. We try. We still have, I don't know how much time. If you miss us on Instagram, you can go on YouTube and we'll repost the interview on Facebook as well. We'll try to cover all the questions. Chiamblin, merci beaucoup. Chiamblin is asking as well, why in the watch, how do you explain, Manuel, that there is no more recipe, De Bethune, or even more crazy watchmakers such as NMBNF and Urwerk? I only add that I think there is a lot more, and we can guide you through that, Chiamblin, but I let Emmanuel answer.
Yeah, obviously, there's much more. There's a lot others, but there's not so many. Let's say it this way. I think the ones that really are there and are visible, also the ones who have really very unique and very distinctive way of approaching watchmaking. I mean, in each of the brands you mentioned, we can all find positive things. I mean, we can like the creativity in certain things. We can like the craftsmanship in others. We can like the innovation in the third one. And I think it is the reality is that these brands are more visible than the others. There is a bit more, but only will, I think, end up remaining the ones which are very clear and very, very, I would say, unique in their approach.
Absolutely. We had if I can mention one, because you talked about Russian brands, we have had a fantastic collaboration with Konstantin Chaikin, and we also have Imperial Petrov factory as well on our website. Yes. So from I
must say, I had the chance to visit Chaikin in Moscow, and I was impressed. I was really impressed. Yes. You know, I mean,
yes,
it's that what I find interesting is this watchmaking that somehow is not so visible because it's not so present or it's not so close to us, but where people maybe in a context that's much more difficult because they don't have the ecosystem, they don't have access to suppliers or even people or knowledge or know-how, are actually able to build something incredible. I mean, I must say, after 20 years in the watchmaking, I have not been impressed by that many people lately, but Chaikin impressed me. Just why? Because he's self-taught, totally built everything from scratch by himself.
I just tell Instagram is over. They're kicking us out. Mark doesn't want us anymore. So guys, if you want to carry on, we carry on for 5 minutes on YouTube. Otherwise, the limited edition watches Facebook page, you'll see Manuel over there as well. Thank you very much. I'm going to go off from now. So, yeah, I can't believe it. Time is flying. We're still on YouTube. Yeah, Manuel, to carry on with your point, you know, guys like Stepan Sarpaneva in Helsinki, or people like Van der Klaauw in Holland, or we've had an amazing interview with Dan Spitz, and actually now there is a live starting with Dan Spitz, a podcast with the Watch Press. Dan Spitz reviving American in-house watchmaking. So it's nice to see that actually there are no boundaries anymore. And yes, the ecosystem is very important, but nothing is impossible. As you know, I visited Chaikin several times as well, and that's a proper manufacturer, isn't it?
I mean, it's even more than a proper manufacturer, because actually the interesting thing is he obviously does a few movements himself. He also buys a few movements, but what impressed me is that he learned all the métier by himself. I mean, he does his own cases, he does his own dials, he does his own hands. I mean, he really is the typical Russian independent logic. He produces whatever he needs by himself, and he learned everything. And this is impressive, because we talk about manufacturing here in Switzerland. Basically, it means we do our own movements. I haven't seen a lot of companies that are as verticalized as he is with a little team. And this,
You see, we've seen the room with the 70 odd patents in Watchmaking.
Yeah. I mean,
again, when you enter.
Yeah, but see, he had no choice. And I think the interesting thing is, watchmaking doesn't necessarily to be Swiss, and it doesn't. I mean, I faced this issue with the discussion in Russia, is that, for a lot of Russians, luxury cannot be Russian, because it's just impossible. Luxury has to be French, Italian, German for watches, German or Swiss for watches, but can't be Russian. And then you have this independent watchmaker which self-taught himself everything and is capable to sell probably the most expensive luxury good in Russia, and this is impressive. And so it means, as you said, I mean, whether it's in Finland, in the US, in Japan, in China, we have independent watchmakers in China as well. They do a beautiful job. I mean, there's no boundaries, but it's definitely not easy. It was definitely not easy in the past because of the ecosystem. And I think with the whole digitalization and all this, it will help to create more platforms for independent international watchmaking.
Brilliant. Listen, Manuel, look, I had a number of other questions, but I suggest we do this again very soon.
Yeah, can do that with pleasure.
I thank you again. There's not a lot of people connecting now on YouTube, because the YouTube channel is something we've just launched. But again, this streaming will be live on our Facebook page, and we will gather any question you have for Manuel. Such a great an elevated conversation that we can have with Manuel. So feel free to shoot all your questions, and maybe we take the opportunity for another podcast to follow Manuel on the next adventure. And I've always said, Manuel, I still think one day we may end up even working together. You never know, and I feel like it would be a great pleasure actually for me personally.
Thank you. Be happy to do so. I mean, and again, I mean, it's I know what it means to be to take risks, to develop businesses, to try new things, and it's good to have people like you who put their efforts, their heart, and their passion into building something that helps to contribute to the watchmaking. And
we try, you try, and you've paved the road a long time ago for that. So it's brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you too.
I'll speak to you very soon. Be well.
Perfect. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.